All right, so this is just I don't know what to call it. It's just kind of something, kind of all over the place, emotional, I suppose. So if you wouldn't mind, go ahead and grab your Bibles. Whether you're on the screen with us or you're here in person, turn it on, open it up, unroll it if you have a really ancient scroll, whatever your preferred medium is. We're going to jump into the scriptures today, and we're going to kick off a new series. Before I do that, though, as was mentioned earlier, we are going through the New Testament together this year, and I just wanted to say that for some of us, getting through the New Testament in a year might be a bit of a challenge. For some of us, that might be really easy, and I want to encourage you to not feel locked into a specific pace, okay? For some of us, it might be quite doable, and you should consider going through the New Testament 3, 4, 5 times this year. So please don't feel locked into having to only read, roughly half a chapter a day, but please feel free to read at the pace that's helpful for you. And in conjunction with going through the New Testament this year, which is really riffing off of last year, we read the whole Bible together, and our series was Finding Our Place in God's Story. And this year, we're looking at the New Testament, and we're theming the year Finding Jesus in His Story. And so, over the course of this year, in 2021, our Sundays are going to be, reasonably sort of paralleling what we're reading and focused on Jesus and the New Testament in particular. And for those of you that are in iron groups in the church, we're also going through a book called Walk Like Jesus together in our iron groups, and we're actually doing it on the Like Jesus app. But for those of you that don't have the app or want to get the app, or you want the physical copy of the book, you can go grab one at our website. It's 50% off. We're only going to do it this week. So if you want a physical book, go ahead and grab one there at the website for any of you that prefer, again, that medium. We don't have any scrolls, so this is just a codex-style book, but, for those of you that want that. So spiritual warfare is going to be the topic that we spend some time on for the next several weeks. I actually was planning on doing something different, and then about 3 days ago, I decided to change it up because, I don't want to say the Lord put it on my heart and blame Him for it. Let's just say I thought it was best. But this past year of 2020 may be one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult years that any of us have endured in our lifetime. It's been very challenging in a number of ways. Some you would expect, and maybe some not so expected. And a lot of times I think we're kind of wondering, what's 2021 going to be like? There are all these funny memes and social posts and videos as 2020 came to a close and as 2021 was opening. But I think a lot of us are really wondering, is it going to get better? Is the vaccine going to help? Is it going to get worse? There's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of confusion, a lot of angst even. And this year, as we're focusing in the New Testament, as we're focusing on Jesus, I want us to really consider where our trust and our hope really is. I've talked about this recently, but if you're newer to the Asheville Church family, welcome. It's great to have you. But I believe that 2020 and potentially 2021 can be used by God for His pruning like never before. And I think that can be a very positive thing, but like everything else, we have a role to play, right? We have a choice to make. We are active participants and not just, robotic, just surveyors of the Lord's will upon us. But I wanted to draw our minds to the fact that our participation in this pruning process, our participation in our faith, in the midst of whatever context we find ourselves in, has something to do with spiritual warfare. As I thought this would be an appropriate place for us to begin this year. And, as you read the scriptures, you find that a lot of times there were periods where people, individual persons, and even entire peoples of God, nation of God, would find themselves in a wilderness setting, a setting that was quite uncomfortable, a place that was dangerous, where life itself was not very assured. And I think in some ways we've kind of come into that kind of mentality and context for ourselves because this past year. Our mortality has been put in front of us like never before. We find ourselves in this kind of emotional wilderness, this sort of emotional, isolated desert type of environment. So I thought this would be good to talk about because the scriptures talk quite a lot about this idea of spiritual warfare. And so we find ourselves in this COVID-19 type wilderness, and sometimes we look like this, right? Especially, I know for me in the beginning, right? No one knew what to do. It seemed like the world just shut down in March and April. Everyone went home. Everything shut down except for essential workers and all those kinds of things. But a lot of us just kind of ended up doing this. Thank you, Michael Lyons, for sharing about how, you quarantined and just ended up playing video games. And, maybe your roommates have a candid picture of you kind of like this somewhere. I don't know. But whatever wilderness we find ourselves in, I want to draw our minds to the fact that we are in a battle. We are in a battle against evil. Evil both outside, without, and also inside and within, which Alex talked a bit about this morning. So kind of where we're going in this introductory series for the year, we're going to talk about today what exactly is the battle that we're fighting, and then we're going to talk about how can we be victorious in this spiritual battle. So what battle are we fighting? Let's look over in John chapter 8. I think that many of us over this past year have been duped. We've been deceived. And no, I'm not necessarily talking about the latest conspiracy theory, but I think that many of us have been duped into thinking our primary battles are against political parties, against privileged white people, against immigrant minority populations, that our primary battle is against Trump and Republicans or against Biden and Democrats. We have been duped. Our primary battle is not against any of these things as disciples of Jesus. And often as you read the New Testament writers, they use analogies for the gospel and the Christian life. They use analogies such as warfare, athletic competition, hardworking farmers, obedient soldiers, as illustrations and parallels for the Christian experience. We are soldiers in a battle. But what kind of battle exactly are we fighting? That's what I hope to discuss a little bit this morning. In John 8, verse 31, Jesus is teaching here. And to the Jews who had believed him, Jesus says this. He says, "If you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free." But the crowds, they look upon Jesus, they answer him, and they say, "We're Abraham's descendants, and we've never been slaves of anyone. How can you say that we shall be set free?" Jesus replied, "Very truly, I tell you, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Now, a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son of that family belongs to that family forever. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed." And then he goes on and really offends them. For Jesus, he says that our primary battle is against enslavement to sin. That our primary battle is a battle against sin. And interestingly, Jesus says that without him personally setting us free, there's only one option for every human being, and that is enslavement. Have you ever felt enslaved? Most of us live in a context where we've not experienced slavery firsthand in a physical, earthly kind of way. Some of us maybe have ancestors or relatives that we know that have, or come from other cultures and parts of the world where that still regularly happens. For many of us in the West, we, like these Jews, descendants of Abraham, receivers of the Constitution of the United States, have never been enslaved. We are free. But Jesus says, no, you're really not. Unless I have set you free, you are still a slave, no matter what your context looks like. So for Jesus here, he frames what the battle is. the battle is actually a battle of sin. And interestingly, you know what he connects freedom with? Not only him personally setting us free, but what is our part? What is our active participation in that freedom process? He says, unless you hold to my teachings, then you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So Jesus connects being freed with truth. And he connects truth with us obeying him, holding to his teachings. I remember the first time I ever read this passage. I remember the first time some other young men in my life sat me down and we read this passage, and they said, what do you think about the fact that Jesus says that he holds the keys to truth and freedom, but you've got to hold to his teachings? My first reaction was, I guess I better figure out what his teachings are. I have no idea what his teachings are. And so for some of us, that's where we have to begin in our battle against sin. We've got to learn, what does the truth keeper say? For some of us, we might know the teachings of Jesus, but we have to have honest, sober reflections in the mirror. We've got to ask ourselves, are we really holding to his teachings? Or have we maybe stopped, where at one point in our life we did hold to his teachings, but not really so much anymore? And maybe we have started to feel and experience that enslaving process start to happen again. If you are feeling enslaved to sin this morning, this is where we've got to start. Your battle is to start holding to Jesus' teachings. Look over in Galatians chapter 5. We pick up the disciple Paul after his conversion to Jesus and his commentary to the church and the Christians in Galatia about what this battle really is. Galatians 5 and verse 13. So here, Paul is speaking to people who are disciples of Jesus, who are Christians. And he says, you, my Christian disciple, brothers and sisters, you were called to be free. What's he hearkening back to? John 8, right? He's saying you were called to be free. Free from what? Free from sin. But do not use that freedom to indulge the flesh or the sinful nature, some of your translations might read. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. There's that word humbly again. For the entire law, all of the Old Testament, all the Mosaic law and the Levitical law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. If you bite and devour each other, watch out, or you will be destroyed by each other. This is to Christians. Did you ever know that Christians could bite and devour one another? Oh, surely not, Pastor John. Maybe you have felt bitten recently. Maybe you have bit someone else. Paul says this is what the battle of sin looks like. So I say this, he says in verse 16, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other, so that you do not do whatever you want. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under law. Paul says that as he frames this battle that we find ourselves in, this spiritual warfare, he says that if we walk by the Spirit, we won't gratify the sinful flesh that tries to enslave us. But notice what he acknowledges. They are always at war with one another. If you've been following Jesus for more than about, say, 24 hours, you have probably felt this conflict, this contrariness, right? This phrase that's translated conflict with each other here in the NIV, it can also be translated opposed to one another, contrary to one another. I love how the New Living Translation says it. He says they are constantly fighting each other. The spiritual warfare is constantly going on for us as Christians. Why? Because we are fighting against our enslavement. We are fighting against the enslavement of the flesh and seeking to walk in freedom with the Spirit of Jesus. So the primary battle for us as Christians is not about politics. It's not about social distancing practices. It's about sin. It's about a spiritual conflict that rages on. And so I want to talk a little bit about some specific ways that I think the battle against sin can shape itself for us right now in our context. Because as we mentioned, this year has been really challenging, and we're facing this spiritual warfare maybe on some new fronts that we've not had to face before. And so it's like we're in our rookie season out there taking fire spiritually and not knowing what to do. Matthew chapter 4. Let's look there. I believe that one of the ways that this battle takes shape for us right now is the battle of being alone, the battle of loneliness, the battle of isolation. Matthew 4, starting in verse 1. This is the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit, after he was baptized, into the wilderness. There's that motif, that concept again, right? A person of God, peoples of God being led into the wilderness for some purpose. He was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil, or also it could be tested. There's some different forks in the road that you could go there theologically, but I won't get into it. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. Thanks, Matthew, tax collector. It's very, very poignant of you. You're right on the ball there. Okay, he was hungry. Got it. The tempter, the accuser, came to him and said, the Satan, if you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread. Bible scholars out there, what does this story sound like so far? Wilderness, 40 days, bread from stone. Any other story that this sound like? The Exodus story, right? When the Israelites wander in the wilderness for 40 years and God provides bread, not from stones, but from the air. Matthew is intentionally depicting this time of testing and temptation of Jesus in the wilderness to hearken back to the Exodus story. Jesus says this to the tempter. He says, it is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. Then the devil took him to the holy city, to Jerusalem, and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. If you are the Son of God, he said, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. Jesus answered him, it is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. All this I will give you if you bow down and worship me. Jesus said to him, away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Then the devil left him, and angels came and attended him. Jesus went to the wilderness and he was alone. And obviously Matthew is depicting this story for his Jewish audience with a very specific purpose in mind. He's wanting to show Jesus as the perfect, obedient Son of God that Israel was not. Israel went out into the wilderness, and what did they do? When the tempter and tester came to them, they grumbled and complained. And they said, let's go back to Egypt. At least we had meat to eat there. You remember the serpents coming and striking them. Matthew's depicting Jesus as the Israelite that never was. He's the one that was able to obey God. But I think that there's something else for us right now. I think there's another part of this story that can be helpful for us in our spiritual battle that we find ourselves in. And that is, how do we handle being alone? Ask yourself, how have you handled being alone? Depression and anxiety is through the roof right now. I have many friends that are counselors that literally are booked for months out. Isolation and being alone has had devastating consequences for the entire world, the entire country, and even for us as Christians. I want to argue that you and I are who we actually are when we're alone. There's a lot of things that we can use as props to get us to not really face who we are just by ourselves. You put someone in isolation, and you're going to see a lot that you might not see otherwise. And we know that isolation is not good for people. We don't need a lot of scientific research and studies to prove that, though there is an abundance of that. We have it from the biblical narrative from the first page. God said, it's not good for man to be alone. There is an element of relationship in the way that He created His image bearers that He Himself could not fill because they only bore a piece of His image. And so He creates woman. He creates partnership. He creates the Azar. He creates a suitable helper. What Adam said is, now this is one of me, after the whole thing with the animals, right? If you go back to 2020, when we began our series in the Bible, we spoke a lot about this, the beginning of the narrative of the Bible in Genesis. There's something very special and unique going on there in the first couple pages, that Adam and Eve are together as companions, as partners in a way that no other creature could be. We know that human isolation is bad for humans, but it can also be revealing. And if we allow it, it can be pruning. One commentator says this about the Jesus and His temptation in the wilderness story. These three temptations that Satan, the accuser, offers in Matthew 4, 1 through 11, it encompasses a remarkable amount of human experience. We are tempted, as Jesus was in the first temptation, to gauge life by human comforts and consumerism. We're tempted, as Jesus was in the second temptation, to misuse spiritual gifts and powers for our own glory and benefit rather than serving others, as Alex was talking about. And the third temptation that the accuser offered is something that we also experience, and that is that we want to seize power for shortcuts, such as equating a particular political agenda with God's will. The Hebrew writer says that Jesus was the perfect high priest who was tempted in every way as we are, yet was without sin. I don't think that means that Jesus literally underwent every possible temptation that a human being could ever undergo, but rather that the temptations He underwent are representative of all human experience. And yet He was without sin. And we have a remarkable window right here in Matthew 4 that Jesus was tempted in ways that we are as well. Ways to use power for ourselves rather than serve others. Ways that when we're alone, we look for comfort, like was mentioned earlier, through video games or entertainment or leisure or drugs or alcohol or sex or pornography. We look for ways to deaden the pain. Jesus was hungry. He was in pain. The accuser says, I can abate that pain for you right now. And Jesus did what every one of us did not. He said, no, I'm going to trust in God when I'm in pain. How does that apply to your life right now? What pain are you in? It could be physical, it could be emotional, it could be relational. We undergo so many different types of pain, but are you willing to follow Jesus, to allow God to be enough, even when He doesn't take your pain away? Look over in Hebrews chapter 2. The spiritual battle, the spiritual warfare that we find ourselves in. I think right now, many of us are finding ourselves in the battle of fear and anxiety, depression. Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 15. I'll start in verse 14. Since the children have flesh and blood, referring to the children of God, he too, referring to Jesus, shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is, the devil, or the accuser, Satan, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. So Jesus in John 8 talks about the enslavement to sin. Here the Hebrew writer talks about an enslavement to the fear of death. And that the power of death held by the accuser was broken by Jesus' own death and overcoming death through the resurrection. And if you're not familiar with the gospel, I apologize because this might be a bit confusing. But Jesus' death and his rising from the dead, the Hebrew author says, you know what it's supposed to do? It's supposed to set us free from our fear of death. But many of us are still living enslaved to fear of death. And we've got to have that honest look in the mirror with the Lord and say, do we really believe? It's easy to say, and I will grant that, right? It's easy to say until you are on that threshold, when you are on that doorstep, when you're in ICU being incubated with COVID and you can't breathe, or you're bleeding out because of a car wreck or a gunshot wound. But the gospel of Jesus is supposed to free God's people from the fear of death, because we believe that death itself has been overcome, that we have victory over death. And I think right now, in a COVID-19 wilderness that we find ourselves in, a spiritual warfare, I think this is one of those battles that we've got to confront. Do we believe, or are we still afraid of death? At the end of the day, guys, the Christian message comes down to life and death. We can talk all we want about living life to the full here and being full of joy and peace and trying to overcome sin, but at the end of the day, the bottom line message is this man rose from the dead, and he says that he's going to allow us to do the same. Do we believe or not? And guess what? For a lot of people today in our world, that just sounds stupid. It sounds crazy. It sounds ignorant. It sounds archaic. It sounds fill in the blank. But guess what? Everybody's going to die. As much as science is trying to stop that and abate that, and as far as our efforts might get, we still have to wrestle with our own mortality. And that is why I believe the message of Jesus will never go out of style, because he deals with the most fundamental question that every human has to wrestle with, and that is questions of life and death. As disciples of Jesus, I want us in our spiritual battle, in our spiritual warfare, to really consider if the decisions that we're making in our day-to-day life, in the life of our families, if they truly reflect a faith that has been freed from the fear of death. Now, this does not free us from using common sense. The gospel frees us from our fear of death, not from using common sense. It doesn't free us from caring for other people. It doesn't free us from denying ourselves, but it does free us from our fear of death. And it's a tricky, high-wire act to walk, to sometimes figure those things out. How do we live free from the fear of death and yet caring and compassionate for other people at the denial of myself? And sometimes there's going to be a spectrum of options and decisions that we make as we try to navigate those things. But what I'm encouraging us and challenging us to do is to really be honest. Are we living free from the fear of death? 1 Peter chapter 5. We'll continue with Peter and his commentary on anxiety and the anxieties of life. In verse 8, well, I'll just pick it up in verse 5, just because humility apparently is the Spirit's, motif this morning. In the same way, you who are younger people, submit yourselves to your elders, to those who are older. All of you, I can't even read any further. Let me just stop right there. That was just, what? Talk about something that's out of vogue, right? When's the last time you saw a commercial uplifting and honoring elderly people? Seriously, think about it for a minute. I'm trying to think. I mean, maybe you see one advertising like an elderly home and trying to but it's pretty rare, right? What is the message that we are sold and inundated with? Youth and beauty is what matters. And that is opposite to the message of God's kingdom. He says, actually, you want to know what, young people, beautiful people? Submit yourself to those that are older. That is so upside down to the world that we live in, the sea that we swim in. The world that we live in says, old people, shut up and go over there. And that might be a little over-exaggerated, but allow me the indulgence to paint with a broad brush. He says, humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. We're going to get into the rest of this passage in another sermon in this series coming up. You know, the Bible talks a lot about anxiety. You know what that tells me? Anxiety's real. It's part of the human experience. It's going to happen. Some of you guys who've been here a while know that I really battled with anxiety in a really intense way a couple years ago, in a way that I had never before. And dagnabbit, if I wasn't just like, why is this happening? Like, this isn't supposed to be happening to me. And all of the rationalizations and justifications that I have, I'm supposed to be stronger than this. I'm healthy. I'm a blah. I'm a this. Just, I don't know what, just this isn't supposed to be happening. And then I remember someone told me, it was actually my mother-in-law. Gotta love your in-laws. She's a spiritual, godly woman, so hallelujah. She said, you know, John, anxiety is a part of life. And it dawned on me oh yeah. I'm trying to get out of something that is a normal part of life. And it helped me to reframe my spiritual warfare. It helped me to frame the warfare instead of me trying to get out of the battle, figuring out how to fight in the battle. And so, Peter here says, guess what? When you have anxieties, this is the way you're supposed to fight. Cast them on God. Well, easier said than done, but what underlies that? What's the faith message that underlies us giving, casting, throwing the things that we're anxious about, afraid of, insecure about onto God? Why? Because we believe that he cares for us, that he loves us, that he sees what we're going through, that he's not aloof and unaware and unattentive, but that he's intimately caring for us. And if we believe this, this inspires and motivates us to have the ability to say, God, I believe that you care for me even though I'm feeling this way, struggling with this, afraid of that, etc. Of course we're going to have anxieties through life. Of course things like what are going on right now in our world are going to exacerbate our anxieties. Of course that's going to happen. But how are we going to choose to battle against them? Are you fighting to throw those onto God and choose to believe that he loves and cares for you over whatever is causing you angst? Or are you simply rolling over and allowing yourself to indulge and ruminate on the things that cause angst while ignoring and forgetting about God's care? And guess what, guys? For some of us, this could be an everyday, every hour, every moment battle. But God is fighting with us. And God cares for us. And we recognize, as we ended last year through the book of Revelation, that one day all sorrow, all pain, all tear, all anxiety is going to be gone. And so that also, because of our faith in that reality, spurs us on to persevere, which we will also talk more about later. Hebrews chapter 6, let's look here. I know that we're jumping around a lot in the scriptures. I tend to try not to do that too much, but this is what we call a topical study. So we're jumping all over the New Testament for now. Hebrews chapter 6. And if you're newer to the Bible or unfamiliar with it, just go ahead and put your bookmark in the table of contents so you know where we're going. But the more we read it, the more we get accustomed to it, the more familiar we get with where things are. Hebrews chapter 6, as I believe we also have to fight a spiritual battle of laziness. In verse 10, God is not unjust. He will not forget your work and the love you have shown him as you have helped his people and continued to help them. Isn't that interesting? All throughout the Bible, we see the connection that love for God is love for people. He says, the love you have shown God as you've done what? Helped his people and served them. And we want each of you to show this same diligence to the very end, so that what you hope for may be realized. We do not want you to become lazy, but to imitate those who through faith and patience inherit what has been promised. The book of Hebrews is written to an older crowd of Christians, likely have been in the faith for many decades. And the audience that it's being written to is an older Christian population that have really started to drift away from their faith. And this drifting process is slow. Doesn't happen overnight. The old adage that Rome didn't crumble in a day, right? And one of the things that the writer here is admonishing this older Christian population that are starting to really veer away from their faith, he says, we don't want you to become lazy. Apparently, at least for this Christian community, that wouldn't apply to any of us or any other Christian community. We'll just say for the sake of argument, it's just them. No one else is dealing with this. But one of the things that they were dealing with is becoming lazy as they grew older in the faith. And I think, personally, I know I've wrestled with this, and I've get the opportunity to talk with people intimately enough to know that it's been a problem for a lot of us. COVID has enticed our sin to be lazy. Getting up and getting dressed and going somewhere now seems like an arduous chore. I saw some Facebook post or something, some social media. Some girl was like, I got all dressed up to go to the grocery store. It was awesome, like the first time she's been dressed up in months or whatever. It's like, it's this whole new context. And I think for us, part of the spiritual battle that we face is not allowing this context, this isolation, this social distancing, this working from home, the whole new lifestyle that we're trying to figure out is that it doesn't allow our character become lazy, but to still keep following Jesus and figuring out what that means. Because look, the world is different. I don't know if it's ever going to go back to normal. What does that even mean? I know where my sinful nature wants to go. It wants to go back to normal. It wants to go back to not being in conflict with the Spirit, but instead enslaving me to laziness. And so in 2021, if we are going to be active participants in the spiritual battle, if we're going to partake in the spiritual warfare, I think that these are a few of the areas that many of us are going to have to engage and fight, and to get others along with us to help fight alongside of us, right? We're not in the proverbial trenches alone. We have one another. We have God's Spirit. We have His Word. We have screens. We have a lot of means that we need to take full advantage of so that we can give ourselves the best fighting chance. I want to end with this. I read this last year. This is a quote from C.S. Lewis, who was writing in the middle of the 20th century when the threat of nuclear holocaust was everywhere. And everyone was living in the threat of a bomb going off. And so he said these words. And then this past year, during the outbreak of the pandemic, N.T. Wright brought C.S. Lewis's quote forward, and he changed the word bomb with virus or viruses. This is the first point to be made. And the first action to be taken is to pull ourselves together. If we are going to be destroyed by a bomb or a virus, let that virus, when it comes, find us doing sensible and human things. Not huddled together like frightened sheep and thinking about viruses. They may break our bodies, but they need not dominate our minds. I think this presses in on what the Hebrew writer was writing in chapter 2, verse 15, that those who are children of God have been freed from that which enslaved them all of their lives before they were children of God, and that is the fear of death. And C.S. Lewis and now N.T. Wright bring this concept forward again. We are all going to die. But how are we going to live the lives that we get? As Christians, as disciples of Jesus, we need not live in fear, dominated by the what if. Now again, obviously this does not mean that we live haphazardly and carelessly, but that we live carefully and in love toward our neighbor. But we do not live in fear. And so as we go into this new year of 2021, not knowing what's going to happen or what's going to come, whether it's going to get better or get worse, we won't live in fear. Let's close together in prayer.